Welcome to the exam preparation session for SC-401, Protect Sensitive Information with Microsoft Purview in the AI Era. My name is Locky, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer based out of Australia. I've been working in and with high compliance environments for almost a decade, and I'm very happy to take you through this exam prep session today. This session is designed to guide you through the essential strategies for taking the exam. Our focus is going to be on strategy and prep, not teaching those underlying concepts. We'll cover the objectives, best practices, tips, tricks, exam key points, and a whole bunch of little things that are good to keep fresh in your mind before you walk into the room. You can find me over on LinkedIn. Feel free to search for me there, and I'd love to hear from you. Now, when you undertake the exam itself, it's going to put you directly on the path for the Microsoft Certified Information Security Administrator Associate Certification. There are 4 key pillars to your journey: a little bit of Microsoft training, including any instructor-led courses, some self-paced online learning through the AI Skills Navigator, hands-on experience, of course, the exam prep sessions like the one you're looking at today, and to make sure they get that hands-on experience, focus on things like data classification, sensitivity, DLP, and retention policies. There's also broader things within the insider risk management ecosystem to encounter. Now, the exam has 3 primary objective domains, and they are equally weighted, unusual for exams in Microsoft ecosystem. There's no single domain that's going to dominate, so don't allocate study time to one over the others, even across the board. First is implement information protection. The second, data loss prevention and retention, and the third, risks, alerts, and activities. We are going to go through each of these objectives individually. Remember, there is no one heavier domain here, so to pass the exam, you'll need to have familiarity across the board. After this session, you'll hopefully be nice and familiar with what's going to be covered in the exam and to gain insights on those 3 key areas. It'll also help you prioritize what you need to revisit for further study. Remember, this is not a replacement for any sort of official training or going through your hands-on experience. What this is to guide you on what to expect, what topics are going to be in the exam, and where to spot knowledge gaps to focus your time and your resources accordingly in your study. So without further ado, let's kick off into Objective 1, Implement Information Protection. There are 3 subdomains we're going to be covering here: implement and manage data classification, implement and manage sensitivity labels in Purview, and implement information protection for Windows, file shares, and Exchange. The slide here lists the full set of skills that you may be tested on for Objective 1. These are may include items, meaning they may not appear on your specific exam. The list is not exhaustive, and we're not going to cover every single skill in detail today, but make sure you have familiarity with all of them before you sit it. For more detailed overviews and to see the full list in your own time, head on over to the official study guide. Now, to begin our exam prep session, we need to remember the information protection framework. In the exam, you need to always have this in your mind because it is the core foundational mental model that everything else that we are going to follow aligns to. First, know your data. If we don't know what's there, we don't know where it's presented, we don't know how to protect it. And to protect our data is the next step, because if we can't protect it, get it in the right spots, we can't understand the risks that are in place. Once we are able to understand the risks, we can prevent data from being lost from the organization. These 3 pillars make up a true governance platform. By putting these in place, you are able to build out something where you can actually reduce user interactions in sensitive areas and ensure that your data stays where it should in the way you should. Remember, know your data, protect your data, prevent data loss, govern your data. These are the 4 steps and 4 stages that you should always try and align questions in the exam to. Now let's start at the top. First, we need to work through data collection to start building out our structure here. There are 4 key areas that we focus on when we're looking to classify information. Data classification, of course, itself is focusing on things like sensitive content with sensitive information types, trainable classifiers. Labels allow us to provide consistent rules once we identify a piece of data and protect data at rest and in transit. DLP, or data loss prevention, allows us to understand how long to keep something and where it should be kept, and honestly, if it should enter a different system. And it ties hand in hand with encryption, which is focused on access control around identity and ensuring that someone who's not authorized to view a file, internal or external, has those protections still in place. For the exam, if you see a scenario describing structured data with predictable patterns, the answer is likely going to be a SIT or a sensitive information type. But if it's talking about unstructured data, we're going to need something called a trainable classifier. These are both types of data classification and what we're going to be looking at next. Now, your sensitive info types, remember, these are predefined pattern structures. Credit cards, social security numbers, keywords, invoices, that is the sort of thing we're looking for here. Not the file itself, but some component of it. If you have some piece of information that identifies something as sensitive in a specific format, this gives us a way to have a high confidence and low false positive rate of identifying a particular file. We have over 300 built-in SITs that are managed by Microsoft. They can't be modified, but you can copy and customize them if needed. And these allow us to work with addresses, medical terms, different sorts of regional variants of bank account numbers and identification numbers as well. If you want to make a custom SIT, there's two options for you here. A keyword dictionary, where you can build up essentially a list of examples, and where you can have instead a regular expression pattern where we can identify some combination of letters and numbers in a particular format to look for. You also are able to set a proximity. So how do we know it's a bank account number? Because the word account is somewhere nearby. Little tips like that can help a lot. Just remember to not confuse built-in versus custom. Your built-in SITs aren't designed to be modified, and they're ease of use for common regulated data types. Customs are not meant for meeting those requirements. They're meant for specific organizational only data, things that are relevant just to you. Now, as an alternative to your standard SITs, we also have those trainable classifiers. If you've got some form of unstructured data that we need to be able to understand, we can essentially use this to easily ID it next time. This means we can ID broad categories like offensive language, source code, resumes, these sorts of things that can come in many different formats and forms, but all follow roughly the same sort of information within it. The real way to make this work is either to use a pre-trained classifier or to have as many options for us to train on as possible. The more you provide of real examples to identify unique content, the better. Remember, there is a critical limitation with trainable classifiers. By design, they do not work on encrypted content. If you see a question that is related to encrypted content and talking about classification, you're going to need to think of different options. Maybe a structured pattern like a SIT is going to be the better way to identify that file, or look into metadata instead. Now, if we do have a larger amount of data, we can also look at an exact data match. These sorts of sensitive information types are designed for structured data from a database. So essentially, if you've got an example DB we can work with, you can use this to detect on things at large scale, up to 100 million rows worth. It works across all of the same sort of experiences that we use SITs commonly, and the recommended experience nowadays is to use that new version. It's just easier, we have a lot of helping hands to help you along the way, and it gives you 10 EDM schemas per tenant. For the exam, if you see something related to organization-specific data, and we talk about comparing values in a structured database, or there is a spot that all of it's contained in a DB, that's an EDM SIT. Don't get distracted though. A document fingerprinting solution, the next thing we're looking at, is not the same as an EDM. EDM is specifically for I have values in a database. Document fingerprinting, on the other hand, is I have a template. So if I have a templated form, something like an invoice that I can look for, I can actually ID documents that are filled out using that form, using the fingerprinting system. Essentially, if you can provide us a blank template, we can create a unique fingerprint that represents that file. Just like with the data matching before, we don't have the ability to work on encrypted or password protected files, but it supports Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, etc. So essentially you can deploy it where you need to. Look for the specifics there in the exam. If we see the words talking about completed copies of a standard form, we need fingerprinting. But if it's talking about exact matches or some other scenario around patterns, look to the other types of classifiers instead. Now, next up, sensitivity labels. Once we have ways of classifying data, we do need to classify it. Sensitivity labels are a way for us to have centralized control over what happens next. By classifying data, we are able to protect content essentially with tagging. This enforces the metadata against it and will persist across apps, devices, services, and it allows us to do important things like encryption or adding watermarks, headers, footers, and being able to ensure that people who are authenticated are the only ones who can access that information. It also allows us to protect AI-generated content across different workloads, preventing access and ability to upload to certain services, or making sure that certain sensitivity labels can't be used in some scenarios. Just remember, if you see something that is related to a question around encryption and enforcement, a sensitivity label is the easiest way to do something like that because you can set the controls once and apply it widely. Now, in terms of implementing those sensitivity labels in practice out in the field, two approaches. We can either apply them manually or we can auto-label. To auto-label, we just need a way to identify what is in the document and if it is sensitive. Use some sort of sensitive information type, trainable classifier, metadata, something along those lines. The main thing to remember is that you must test first. There is a simulation mode for a reason. So if you're applying different sensitivity labels to documents that relate to financial components, can everyone in the financial team still access what they need? The advice that we see and the thing you need to remember of a starting point is always high compliance first. Work with your most sensitive data because it is generally the smallest component of your organization's data estate, and then build from there. If you see something about how to build out, how to plan, most sensitive first and continue from that point on. There is also a few ways to explore what has been classified. The first is the Content Explorer. This is around trying to understand what's been classified, what's been labeled, and where it's been labeled. There's also two roles. Know the difference between them. A Content Explorer is a list viewer that allows us to just see the general components, and we also have the Content Viewer. The Content Viewer is more focused on privacy components around understanding the exact file content. There is important differences between those two. One is a much more privileged role, so assure you're assigning the correct one, and if you see a question about it, think least privileged first. What's the minimum required to be able to do my job with that role? Now, the alternative is the Activity Explorer. Rather than interested in individual files and their content, we are instead trying to understand where sensitive data is. Now, this has a lot of really interesting use cases, such as the ability to find where we're seeing high use cases of sensitive data or where we've got policy gaps that are not capturing things. If you do see something in the exam around label adoption within the tenant, it's actually not Activity Explorer you need. You need Content Explorer. This is about understanding where the content lives, who's using it, and broadly the trends that we see. Just remember the difference between the two. Now, when we choose to go and deploy sensitivity labels, you must remember the prerequisites. E3 minimum, E5 for advanced features are the licensing requires when we need auto-labeling or Copilot integration. There's also specific roles that you must assign. Again, remember least privilege. If you see the word administrator in the role in the exam, you know it's a highly privileged role, so know the difference between each of them. For example, if we are trying to deal with a high sensitivity scenario, we have options for being able to assign roles such as the Purview Information Protection role group or the Purview Information Protection Administrator or Compliance Administrator role. Each of these represent different nuances of access across the structure. Remember for the exam that labels can apply in lots of areas, but always think of the core ones. Office documents and emails, M365 groups, SharePoint sites, OneDrive files, Teams meetings, and calendar items. Those are the big six to keep in mind. Now, as you build out your sensitivity labels, things will change. There will be times where you need to update or modify labels because something changes in legislation or legal practices, or frankly, the business just has a rethink of what needs to be done. Every label should be considered as something with a life cycle. It has a starting point where we create and configure, then we publish it, test it out in simulation mode and apply. We analyze and refine over time, and at some point, we will need to retire it. We can either keep the label active and everything will still be classified as such, but no new content can be applied that way, or we can replace. Keep the content accessible, but move it across to that new label. The big thing to remember is that new labels don't show up immediately. If you see something around, why can't I see a label, or it hasn't been published yet, or we don't see it, remember it is always publish, then apply. A, then B. It is a very common piece and it is likely to come up in the exam as a potential. Why can't we see that label there? Now, in addition to individual files and groups and things like that, we can also apply sensitivity labels to a concept called a container. Containers are designed to apply labels to a collaborative space broadly. So M365 groups, teams, SharePoint sites, these are kind of the big things where we can set broader privacy controls against something wider. Now, this is primarily focused on ways of being able to kind of identify areas of sensitivity rather than individual files. Remember the distinction that you can still apply sensitivity to individual files at the file level separate to the container level. There is design principles around why we do it this way. So if you need both, remember, you need to have two different applications of that sensitivity component. Now, advantages of this for something like Teams means we can start thinking about different types of attendees roles. For our different meetings, there's actually a lot of considerations in here. So if you see something around watermarking, permissions, and trying to set defaults of how a meeting behaves, look to containers. That is how we look to achieve it there. Now, it is, of course, more than just what we see in terms of the individual files and the broad container structure. The big lesson that you need here, and the big thing you need to remember for the purposes of what we're doing in the exam, is that all of the different label types are created in Purview, but applied by admins in their subject matter expert area. Outlook email settings have a separate portal for applying compared to Teams, SharePoint, and your Entra ID components. For the exam, just remember where you need to apply these pieces. If you are working in Purview, you design these labels, but they set the scopes and where they apply based on their subject matter expertise of how it works in their environment. This is a really important piece to remember for the context of the exam there. Outside of the sensitivity components we've looked at so far, access-based components, always remember there is actually a separate encryption piece you can set at the label level. There's a few different layers of encryption that we apply. By default, everything's already encrypted in the Microsoft 365 services space using platform managed keys. But in highly sensitive environments, you may need to apply a combination or both of Azure Rights Management. Essentially, we encrypt files a second time, but require the ability for someone to log in to unlock that file, or adding a secondary layer of encryption in the form of a key that you control. Customer control keys are typically used by financial sector customers, banking customers, those in ultra high compliance scenarios. So just remember the differences between them. If you see a scenario talking about restricting content, rights management's what we need there. But if you see something about legislative, legal, or some sort of compliance-based requirement, it's more likely a customer key is the additional layer of encryption we're looking for. Now, it's pretty interesting because once we start thinking about rights management, we can also start thinking about what happens to our sensitive data when it leaves the organization. Sensitivity labels can actually trigger encryption as something leaves, adding something like an NPME layer, both in transit and rest. It means that when a recipient receives that email, they will actually have to then go input a passcode to be able to access it. We can also put restrictions in terms of copying, printing, forwarding on these pieces directly. All of this is really important, but frankly, there is one more piece that matters more than anything else. Revocation. Remember for the exam that if we see a scenario related to revocation of a message, the ability to have a message sent and then say, no, you can no longer access it because time has passed or something has changed, we have the ability to do that if we apply encryption to the message. It's a critical, easy piece to miss if you don't think about it directly. Now, don't fret. We know that not all information is in the cloud. If you have a local SharePoint server or something that you need to scan on premises, there is an information scanner specifically built for that purpose. It is designed to look across file shares like SMB shares, different Windows Server components to be able to help identify sensitive data there too. The big thing to remember is you just got to start in discovery. This is something where you can go through that applies sensitive labels directly to on-prem content, and that could have existed for a much longer time in your cloud environment. It will take time to classify, so make sure you're thinking about the different pieces. And always remember, use discovery mode first. That is the critical thing to always think about in terms of your steps. Now, We've covered a lot of content very quickly within this piece, but I hope this has given you a good overview of the different things you can expect out of the objective. We looked at implementing and managing data classification, how that sort of works at a high level, the different types of sensitive information that we can use, and the different classification methodologies. We looked at how to implement and manage sensitivity labels as well, how you can apply them, what the purpose of them is, and what they can do for you. And then I've given you a little bit in terms of both the email-based structure, some things around identity, and how to work with your on-premises file shares using the scanner. Now on to Objective 2, implementing data loss prevention and retention. There's 3 subdomains here: how to configure data loss prevention policies, implementing and monitoring Microsoft Purview Endpoint DLP, and implementing and managing retention. These are all critical when we work in any sort of scenario that deals with high compliance. Legislative, legal, take your pick. But we need to make sure that we know when our data is kept, when our data is moved, and where our data is being used. This slide lists the full set of skills that you may be tested on for Objective 2. These may include items, don't forget, so they may or may not appear in your exact exam. The list isn't exhaustive, we're not going to cover every single piece today, but if you need a detailed overview or the full list to review in your own time, you can head on over to the official study guide. Now, we can also implement DLP at the endpoint level. Endpoints, like what end users use, have different sorts of restrictions we'll need to apply though. Think about preventing files from being copied to a USB device, or preventing a mass printing of data, or at least alerting when people take those actions there. Just like other DLP policies, it is still simulate, deploy, monitor. Still make sure you go through and use these. For the exam, the big thing to remember is that there is a range of different ways we can apply these controls, but the recommended methods are Microsoft Intune, using Defender for Endpoint in some setup like that, group policy, or a local script. The critical other one is, remember that you can also apply these at the browser level. There are extensions for the major browsers and direct integration with Microsoft Edge for Business. So if you are seeing a scenario where a user cannot access it or the DLP is not enforcing, we need to first check, is the extension actually being applied? Always remember that as part of the structure. It's an easy troubleshooting step that will come up early. Now, DLP can also apply directly to broad applications. If we think of endpoints as the devices users use, Defender for Cloud Apps looks at the applications in the cloud that people utilize. Now, this allows us to do some very interesting things. For example, if you are concerned about unmanaged AI applications, ChatGPT, Google Gemini, DeepSeek, the general home use version of Copilot, we can actually use inline web traffic policies to prevent upload of sensitive data types to those applications. You're going to need a SASE provider like GSA Internet Access from us to be able to actually enforce this, but this can allow you to really control untrusted cloud and AI applications. Just remember, if we are looking at this for the exam, this is not replacing something like a network enforcement component that we would see elsewhere, nor is it replacing what we would do in endpoint protection, browser protection, etc. These go together hand in hand. We can block the data from being moved around at the actual device level and implement things against unmanaged applications. We want to be able to control at all layers here, so they go together, not separately. Now, that unmanaged AI apps, let's focus in on that in a little bit more depth here. There are actually already specific policies you can apply to make this work, and the inline web traffic policy is designed to target those applications out of the box. What's great is that you can apply this either to the organization as a whole or focus more on certain users that are using sensitive data generally. This is a just-in-time protection capability too, so it is the moment when someone attempts to write a prompt or send data. We are focused on ensuring that the wrong type of data does not go to the wrong moment at the exact last possible second. There's many other places we can capture it. We need a last line of defense. In the exam, if you see something around temporary delays, you see it around different types of classifications, you see things that are talking about a pause. We're thinking just in time. That is what we're using here. Think just in time solutions where we need that last line of check and defense. Now, each one of these different things that we can potentially trigger not only can trigger an enforcement action, but also an alert. The alert cycle has 6 different stages it will follow through. First, we trigger the alert, then we'll notify people, and it's up to you to start triaging, investigating, and remediating. Make sure that you tune your alerts. There is a lot of different incidents that can come through, and out of the box, we retain these for up to 6 months. So, what do you want to see? How much do you want to see come through? Lots of different alert types can be built out as well, depending on specific license capabilities you have within the environment. For the exam, just think about the policy configurations and the different options for alerts. If you're dealing with low volume, high sensitivity, make a single event alert. This gives you a high severity that you can push out immediately and everyone knows is there. But if you need to deal with threshold or aggregate levels for lower sensitivity DLP policy components, that is a better way to reduce fatigue, and so just remember the differences there. Now we've looked at enforcement, keeping things where they should be. Now let's make sure we keep data for as long as we need to. Data lifecycle is not about keeping data forever. No, not at all. It is about ensuring that it is kept for exactly the amount of time the business needs it. One of the worst things that you can do for data security is keep something for infinite amount of time. So for every piece of information you bring into the business, it must have a life cycle. How long do we keep it? Does it need to be enforced? Is it something that's required by legislation? Is it a legal requirement, a policy requirement, a compliance requirement? And at what point do we mark things for disposal? If you're looking for common things for the exam, 7-year, 10-year, 12-year. These are the classic 3 that we tend to see in a lot of regulatory requirements, and will tell you that we are looking for a data lifecycle component of a DLP policy. That's how we'll do it, and we'll use that as our mechanism to ensure things are kept for the right period of time there. Now, when we're using these, we can actually have 2 different ways of applying that retention. Retention labels are focused on individual items. So manual or auto applied, we can mark content as a record that needs to be kept for a period of time for whatever it is for your particular requirement. They're pretty coarse-grained. You can basically apply them wherever you need, and they're an easy way to work with where you need to apply to specific components. Retention policies are instead focused on a broader approach, like a mailbox or an entire Teams channel. Think C-suites. C-suite executives typically need to have their data kept in a specific manner, especially in financial spaces. So if we just need to keep that mailbox for 7 years, we can just do that by applying a policy. For the exam, you must remember the difference between these. Labels apply to items, policies apply to areas. Ensure you keep in mind the difference between the two from the specific or the generic. Now, when to apply your retention? When someone says you have to, that's the real reason here. We want to make sure that we are actually keeping things only as long as they are useful. So really think, for every piece of data that comes through, where do I set it to? We do actually have an entire mechanism for what we call a disposition review. So the moment before it is deleted, you can actually put something in a review queue. You can work with the team to make sure that retention policies have all of the things kept for the right period of time. But there is going to be something that may pop up in the exam. 7 days. 7 days is how long a retention policy can take to apply. Not consistently, it is an up to a mark. But if you need to apply a retention policy quickly, we may need to work with legal teams to help identify any missed documents in that first week period. Apply them early and apply them as early as possible in your environment setup to make sure that you don't miss anything critical. Last little piece here, let's talk about precedence, because there is actually an order of operations between retention and different types of labels and different types of policies and when and where they get applied. There is a clear precedent rule set. First of all, retention beats deletion. If any policy says to keep the document, it's kept. Longest retention wins. One says 1 year, one says 7 years. It's being kept for 7 years. Labels will override policies, so if we apply to a single item over a broad thing, that wins, and the shortest deletion as a last point will win. If something has delete only at the end, so when it's done, get rid of it, if one says 7 days and one says 1 day, we will keep it for the one that says that. Essentially, if an item has a retention label to keep 3 years and a policy says to delete after 1 year, we will go with the retention first, and then the delete would be the secondary piece if it doesn't come through. There is a lot of interesting nuances to this. Like, we've got file recovery in terms of recycle bins. We've got version histories to be able to roll files back. So there is many different ways to prevent files from being deleted broadly. Retention is only for states where we need to keep something explicitly for a long period of time. For the exam, really remember the difference here. Retention is for legal and compliance reasons, not for I accidentally deleted something and I need to restore it from the recycle bin. We have plenty of other mechanisms already in place for that. So, as a little recap here for Objective 2, we covered some pretty key areas. We took a look at data loss prevention policies, those DLPs, and some of the different ways we can enforce them, such as endpoint protection or the browser extension. We had a look at how to monitor the different types of DLP components to make sure they're being applied correctly, and of course, a little bit about retention at the end to make sure you're keeping your data for exactly as long as it needs to be kept and no more. Our last objective is Objective 3, manage risks, alerts, and activities. And there are 3 subdomains in this. Implement and manage Purview inside of risk management, manage information security alerts and activities, and protect data used by AI services. We've already had a little bit of a look at AI services, but let's start looking not so much at unmanaged applications, but what we can do for sanctioned applications and how to manage data within that context there. This slide lists the full set of skills that you may be tested on for Objective 3. As always, these are may includes. They may or may not appear in your exact version of the exam. The list isn't 100% exhaustive, and we're not going to cover every skill in detail today, so be sure that you've got familiarity with all of them before you walk in. As always, you can view the full list in your own time over on the official study guide. Microsoft Purview Insider Risk Management is where I want to start. This helps organizations identify and address internal risks by analyzing user activity while still preserving their privacy. There are 4 stages: plan and prepare, connect data sources such as HR systems, create policies to trigger investigations, and then investigate and respond. The goal here is to ensure that when an insider risk actually occurs, a user misusing data or maliciously or unintentionally accessing things they didn't mean to, we are able to detect through pattern recognition. We're able to see potential data leaks, security violations, compliance issues, and surface them through in a central spot as a risk profile. This gives us alerts that we can look at, and by default, there is pseudonymization in place. For the purpose of the exam, there's one critical thing you need to remember. IRM is not the same as DLP. Whereas DLP is focused on enforcement at the item level, IRM is behavior and intent. Now, they are going to work together for the purposes of that adaptive protection, but they are for very different purposes. Now, when we look at IRM, one of the first things we need to consider is where is our best source of truth to understand potential threats. The most common thing that you will need to focus on is HR. Getting some sort of policy template for data theft, trying to understand when a user is marked for leaving an organization, this is important. But we can also think about healthcare connectors. If you're working within a healthcare sector, patient data misuse is going to be one of the important things to search for. Physical badging, access to and from buildings, these are all critical things that are signals that will tell us if a user is behaving in a manner that is unusual compared to their cohort. All of these different connectors can't be enabled by anyone. If you see something in the exam about it, it must be the data connector admin role. It's a very specific role designed specifically for the purpose of integrating IRM solutions like this. Now, easy way to remember it. If you were trying to work out where to implement this, how to think about different app policies, just remember IRM is around integrating those data sources and then thinking about how we can identify risk. Once we have that, though, you can start applying these templates in different ways. We've got templates out of the box to capture the majority of common sorts of scenarios that we see. Some of these are going through preview and may be renamed by the time you see them, but there's always new templates being built out. Browser usage, risky AI usage, these all represent common scenarios that organizations will run into. If you see something in the exam about a scenario that you see on here, the goal is to remember some of these core templates and that there likely is a template already in place. One of the things to remember, though, is that each of these templates may have prerequisites. So for an example, departing users, we need a HR data source first. So there's always a prerequisite of get your data before we can make the policies do their job. Now, there are a few different types of policy creation options. Remember the difference between them for that exam. We can look at quick policies Easy, pre-configured, common risks, common data spaces. Think data leaks, email exfiltration. And for a standard implementation for an organization that wants to roll it out rapidly, this is where you go first. But if you have something in particular you need to work with, you're dealing with very specific scenarios around healthcare logs, you're working with complex multi-stage cases, that is where the custom policy component sits in place. Easiest thing is to start with a template. You don't have to, but it is there. And then build out the indicators. More indicators means more areas we can understand. So if you want to look at file transfers, USB usage, browser activity, you want to be able to look at HR components, we need to get the data in. There is also a way to prioritize content. If you see something around risk weighting, that is a content prioritization. It allows us to apply to certain sensitivity labels, file types, SharePoint sites, that sort of stuff as example. Additionally, for some of these different policies, there may be scenarios where you cannot use pseudonymization. You actually need to see who it is because it is such a sensitive use case. If that is the case, remember, it must be a custom policy and you can change it to turn that off. It's a default, but it is overridable for some very select circumstances if that is what's needed. So, we have ways of being able to create these policies. But there is one more step that we really need to think about, and it is forensic evidence capture. This has a major prerequisite of requiring the Purview client agent to be installed on end user endpoints. What it will actually do is capture screenshots at the time of the risky action and any text input that is in a browser field. This is not something that should be viewed with any sort of ease, though. There is a multi-step approval process where we require multiple different types of users to be able to say, yes, we want to view this information. Common scenarios would be an administrator from a security team and someone from a legal or HR perspective to be able to understand. Remember, for the exam, that dual approval. It is one of the most important things to consider when we're dealing with direct screenshots and evidence. It is a sensitive use case. It requires a sensitive system and a plan and a policy about when it is allowed to be utilized. Now, once we have implementation, IRM shows its secondary point. The policies are in, they're created, we get them done in place, and now we have a case management system in as well. The moment an alert pops up, we can trigger it to raise a case, or you can manually escalate it to a case. Within that case structure, we can have all of the important people relevant to the conversation. HR, legal, security teams, administrators, anyone who needs to be involved, and they can be given permission to that specific component. Now, do note, this is not the same as an investigation in something like Defender XDR. This is designed to assist with the alerts related to the insider risk, and then we can flow those across to that larger security platform. The case itself, though, will still live in Purview. This is designed for scenarios where if you see something in the exam about like escalating to legal or HR, or being able to send a template to the user to notify that they've taken an action, these are the sorts of things we can do here. Remember your notice templates as well. They are an important piece of notifying a user that they have taken a misstep, and in some jurisdictions, it may be a legal requirement that you do that when an investigation begins. All right. Now, we covered a little bit of adaptive protection earlier, from a DLP perspective specifically. But within IRM, there is also the components of that minor, moderate, and elevated risk level. In fact, this is where they get calculated. We use this as the origin for those signals. You should be treating IRM as the hub. It's the thing that we use to set the signal levels that we're going to use for both the data lifecycle management components in DLP and also over in the conditional access policies for the logging component. You set here the high risk thresholds of what is that low, medium, high style risk, and then you can apply the different types of controls based on what you need to do down there. Just remember for the exam, this is where we configure and set up our adaptive protection that is used by everyone else along the way. If it talks about licensing, E5 plus IRM, that is the language to look for in terms of the options. Okay. Now, once you have all of this information in place, we can think about broader audit logs as well. Outside of IRM, we still need to audit what's going on, what activities people have taken, all of that sort of stuff. There is a couple of different options here, and out of the box, Standard gives you default 180-day retention with access through the portal. It's easy for basic user and admin actions of smaller organizations. But there are scenarios where you may need to keep these audit logs for a longer period of time, up to 10 years. You need to change the policy of retention for different parts of the organization. We need to be able to keep these in certain scenarios. Or, and critically for the exam, the reason you typically pick the premium version of audit, a high API bandwidth export. What do we use this for? Large organizations that need to take the data from the audit log and put it into a secondary location to be able to export and use it elsewhere. If you see something around a regulator and it's talking about a 9-month period in the exam, 180 days isn't going to reach it. That is a cutover to the premium version instead, because the 1-year default will reach it. If you see something about export, look for the number 50,000. There is up to 50,000 records export available via the portal, PowerShell API in standard, but premium supports an API streaming version, which allows you to be able to do deeper insights and categorization out to external locations. Okay, let's put it all together. Once we have identified a potential insider threat or a misuse of information or something that is a violation of policy, the investigation begins. There are 2 questions that we are being asked. What happened? Who, what, when, why, how? And what was involved? We can term these in a few different ways. Audit is designed to answer the who, did, what, when. Content search and e-discovery, what we're about to look at, is answering the blast radius. What was actually picked up and how bad is the damage from the particular thing that we have enacted? These different Activity Explorer components are all around trying to understand what the actual damage is. When we see an alert that comes through and it talks about different types of statuses that are here, different availability components, or we bundle this up to XDR and we see an incident, we need to understand easily as a subject matter expert what exactly was breached, what exact scenarios we need to work with. Now for the exam, there is a little abbreviation you should be looking for. SOC, or Security Operations Center. If you see something about the SOC, they typically use something like Defender XDR or Sentinel. The compliance teams that we have managing Purview are going to be able to pass alerts and various incident information to them externally. Different purposes though. We want to be able to send the data and the alerts over to that system, but we as policy people will manage our investigations internally here. The tools are built for those who understand Purview specifically. Now let's talk about those searching tools that we have. The really big one is e-discovery. In fact, content search as part of the e-discovery experience is one of the best ways to deal with cases of not just insider threat management and searching for blast radiuses, but also something kind of very practical. Freedom of information requests, legal trawls, the things that we need to be able to go hold and preserve data for whatever purpose we need. There are 3 different roles that are important here. There is an e-discovery manager, someone who creates and manages e-discovery cases and can export all the data from that assigned case. An e-discovery administrator, the manager who actually runs the thing. And because global admins do not automatically have e-discovery access, there is also a separate administrative role for managing the rest of Purview. Note that difference for the exam. An admin does not have access to e-discovery by default. It is a separate set of permissions, and we have built it out that way so there is a separation of duty here. Make sure that if someone is going through and you're dealing with something around least privilege, the likely answer is an e-discovery manager for case management, not an administrator, and it will rarely, if ever, be a question about the broader Purview administration roles. Now, to support some of our investigations, you may also be interested in something like communication compliance. This helps you identify messages, individual messages in a Teams environment where we can actually take a look and see back and forth what's ongoing. Now, as much as I mentioned Teams, remember for the exam, this is not just Teams. Communication compliance is about auto-triggering and reviewing content of communications between people. This is detecting offensive language, conflict of interest, and it can be integrated with a large number of different platforms. Make sure you don't confuse it with DLP, blocking sharing, or insider risk management, which is looking at behavioral patterns. This is, I have sent a message that is bullying or has a specific kind of cadence to it or may represent a specific type of threat just within that communication platform. Very particular, very useful. Now, as a last port of call, let's quickly talk about DSPM for AI, a broad category of policies that frankly just kind of exist across Purview. We're doing our best to centralize these in a DSPM field to give you one spot you can go to for all of the AI protection you need. But know that each of these are implemented in different sections of Purview. We're just trying to keep it easy through a four-phase lifecycle approach. First, discover your activity. We go through the Activity Explorer to reveal the usage and oversharing related to AI tools. Find out if your users are actually using things that may represent a threat. The audit logs contain your AI interactions within it, and anything we can hook in from network devices and external log stores, we should. IRM will look at the risky behavior, understanding where data may or may not be used, or representing the use of external kind of third-party AI tools that are unsanctioned as a threat. And then we have various types of DLP policies to restrict on endpoints, browsers at the network level to govern the components. And of course, anything that is generated or used by AI, we can also use all of the same lifecycle components to store not just the things that come out of it, but prompts, responses, these sorts of things that must be kept for various legal and compliance reasons. What this gives us is a way to respond. Essentially, if you are thinking about AI-based protection across any of the various tool sets that you can theoretically access, we have the tools within Purview to help you with your data estate management and make sure that everything fits together. For the exam, just remember the prerequisites. Audit needs to be enabled first, so prompt and responses are logged. Devices must be onboarded so we can actively look at third-party AI side activity. And if you don't have that, at the very least, the Purview browser extension must be deployed so we can enforce when and where things can and cannot be used in the Purview stack. Now, let's cover our last few pieces here. If I just want to walk through a scenario, an actual real scenario here around how we can prevent the risky use of AI in an environment. I want you to imagine that a user has jumped on their computer and they've jumped onto your AI tool of choice out in the market, some third-party generative AI tool that is used in an unmanaged location. What they then do is they take confidential customer data and they copy it in and they start asking questions about how to use it. Let's walk through how Purview will respond. First, we'll flag the unmanaged AI application using something like Defender for Cloud Apps to mark that something has gone wrong and a sensitive piece of data has left, sensitive information type. Endpoint DLP via the browser extension will block or warn the user. Your choice in terms of what level of enforcement you need here, and maybe it depends on the sensitive type of data. The insider risk management will then raise the user risk level if the behavior repeats or immediately. That is also your call. Then adaptive protection starts escalating. The DLP policies start coming into play. They're no longer allowed to open those sensitive documents. And communication compliance reviews the AI-generated text it surfaces in email or Teams. This means we can now verify what happened next, what was actually revealed, what was then pulled back, how was the data interacted with. This gives you an end-to-end scenario to think about. And for the exam, try and come up with these scenarios in your head. You can see how each of the technologies map to each of these components. So really think about how would these be used in practice. This is just one of the many, many examples of how we can use Purview's different layers to get you the best possible protection at every layer. Security is a multi-layered approach. We're never going to capture everything with one big wall. It's about putting up lots of walls to ensure that we capture every little piece along the way. Just get your things onboarded, enable your audits, and do the things you need to get your environment set up. As a quick recap, we covered just then how to implement and manage insider risk management as a primary spot. That's your data source integrations, forensic analysis, stuff like that. But we also looked at security alerts, activities, and different ways that we can protect data when we're using AI services, mostly as an example. Something you can latch onto as a practical piece to have in your mind. Have a scenario like this in your head, a real scenario that you're aware of that you can leverage if you want to be able to map in an exam question. It's a great way to be able to really think about the technology, not just from what it can do, but also the real practical components of how it would work for a real customer. Throughout the exam prep session, we have covered a lot of different areas. We discussed how to implement information protection across sensitive data, sensitivity labels, containers, and we looked at DLP policies to prevent data leaks and use different types of retention components to keep things for only the amount of time that they need to be kept. And we've just finished covering some of our risking alert components that are available to you. Make sure you review these areas using the official SC-401 study guide to really solidify your understanding. I want to thank you for joining us today, and good luck on the exam.